bound to occur. So expecting them will ensure the proper workingness of or the ease of troubleshooting the problem and eventually avoiding those situations. Some of them is user created, meaning whoever is using the flow, or the program that's connected to the flow, or the Sky add-in that's connected to the flow, all of that. Some of it is outside of user is really system related. For example, you trying to do something and a black box may be down. For example, it has happened once in a while in a blue moon, but expecting it will allow you to handle those situations more appropriately. So we're going to go into some of these demos, just a few bullet points to go through. We're going to talk about a workflow expression that's going to be useful for identifying the specific workflow that we are in, a specific instance of the flow that we're in. We'll talk about using scope as a container to encapsulate chunks of code, well, not code, but chunks of actions. And then we'll be able to do a little bit with it in terms of like almost like atomicity, if that's the right word to say it. And then don't worry about that too much. We'll see what that means. We'll also look into configuring run after to have multiple paths when certain things fail or certain actions fail or timed out. We'll also talk about using terminate as an action to stop the flow after a certain exception or error is detected. So we're not always just waiting within the flow or just run through the flow, even though we have some errors that will prevent future actions, subsequent actions to fail also. So we'll take into that consideration. We'll also take a look into maybe using team messages or sending email to alert errors that happen that requires your attention. And we'll go into each one of those a little more. Okay, so let's get into, let's see. Okay, so I loaded a whole bunch of flow that I have, but some of them will be applicable for each one of the item we talk about. So the first item we mentioned was workflow expression. So I have this on almost every single one of my flow. Okay, basically what it is Microsoft Power Automate way of, let's go to one of them, for example, here. So here. So workflow itself is an expression. It doesn't take in any parameter. So all it does is workflow. And what it is, it provides you back a JSON data object that gives you information about the instance of the flow that is happening, right? So let's say you manually trigger a flow, that's an instance in itself. Let's say you have a form, Microsoft form, let's say, and you have a flow that triggers every time the form is submitted, that's an instance. Every time the flow is submitted, it's an instance of the workflow. This workflow expression will give you a bunch of information, okay? So for example, it will give you the ID, name, type, all of that is good stuff. It'll tell you the flow display name. So in this particular case, the flow display name is this thing called BB, SFTP, record process, okay? The environment name, this is the environment name, and then various different information about the flow itself and the flow instance that is running. What's this useful for? This is useful for bringing you, the one that created the flow, back to the instance that failed. So basically, we're kind of jumping right into this last one here, use team message to alert error and get your attention. So this is a team message. When something fails, I basically send myself a message and say, hey, the flow display name, whatever the flow name is, has failed. Here's the link to the failed instance, right? So this is how you compose this link that basically is make.powerautomate.com. The environment name is in the workflow expression. So you use that /flow/the name. That is also in the expressions. The run, which is giving you the run name. With all of that pieces of information, it will take when actually, if I could, I actually shut down Teams just so I can save some bandwidth. So you know what? Let's not open Teams right now because I'm not sure if my bandwidth will allow me to do so. At the end, if I can, I'll show you what this looks like. So basically, this gives you a link that say, hey, to view the failed flow run, click on this, and it'll take you to the flow run right away. Sometimes it's also important in your request that you may record this particular link into your request so that, hey, if you need to go back to it and see the error, or potentially not necessarily see the error, but to see the actual run of the flow, how it went down, this is the link to go to that flow run instance. So a very important expressions to use. I use it on every single one of my flow, just so I can capture the error, plus I can potentially capture the run for later on investigation and things like that. Okay, so now we go into the next one that talks about a scope container. Scope is basically an action in itself, but it does really nothing, right? It doesn't do anything. But what it does do is it encapsulates the pieces of work that you want to do. So let's, for example, let's say this, right? We have a form that takes in information and then generate a QR code and send it to the to our the requester. Okay, so a QR code generator. So basically, after getting information, I have a scope object. A scope action, which basically I call it scope flow process. Basically, everything that's being done is encapsulated into this one container. And within it is everything that I'm going to do. So basically, I have actually a separate flow, a child flow that actually runs to create the link that I'm going to generate the QR code on. Are we using logo into the QR code and the logo path that I want to save this logo? At the end of the QR code is going to be an image where I'm going to save it and then do the work. Ultimately, this scope object is going to go ahead and capture all of these actions within it. And then what I can do here is I can use the next item here we talk about is configure run after. So basically what I can do here is I can have this error message that's set up. Again, all of those workflow expression information to bring me back to the fail flow. I'll be able to do a configure run after and say, hey, this scope and everything that's running within it, if anything were to fail in this whole scope of work, all these actions, if anything were to fail, has failed, then run this action to send a message, error message to my team. Of course, you don't have to do that. You can send an email. Okay, you could also send an email and have the email have the link to the failed flow. Okay, so instead of worrying about every single step of the way, in this one, it's not exactly great to demonstrate this. I'll go to another one. I'll talk about this a little bit in regards to how much is too much. We'll talk about that. But basically, the only place that the action will fail is actually in, if you can excuse me just one moment. Okay. I cannot mute. I'm just going to. Go. I apologize for that. I'm getting some background noises that I need to tell him to go down. Apologize. But coming back to what I was talking about, this particular scope of work, there's only a few things that's happening. It runs a child flow, which can fail. Whatever it is that it's doing to generate the QR code, that can fail. And then condition cannot fail. It's just really saying, hey, well, actually, I should say that it could potentially fail. But the likelihood of it failing is low, right? The compose method action, I don't want to say method, action, the compose action likelihood of it failing is near zero. That's just if Microsoft really down and stuff like that. But this is unlikely to fail. So in a sense, the only one that I truly worry about is the run child flow. So meaning, could I have the run child flow has a parallel branch? I'm not going to save this, but could I have a parallel branch that say, hey, if this fails, then run my post message to say, hey, if fail. So I could actually do this. For example, the when the child flow fail, then produce the message that say error. Well, actually, I moved it the wrong item. Sorry. What I should have moved is actually, hold on, the fail message is what I wanted to move. Let's come back to here. So what I could have done is say, hey, child flow, if you fail, then produce the error message to the teams that brings me back to the flow to investigate the problem. Otherwise, on the normal run, everything goes well, then do the rest of your work and then put the chat message to the requester with the QR code, right? So I could potentially do that. Now, I'm ignoring the part that, hey, if in the future, if I were to do a lot more within the run, then now I have to worry about what if other action fails. So that's the reason for me to put the send message of fail outside of the full scope of the work. So that's how you really want to use scope to like put a bunch of action together. And if any of those actions fail, then you can handle that batch of actions, right? So coming back to here, now the next item we talk about is using the terminate to stop the flow of the when error is detected. Okay, so one of the one that I can use here is okay, pledge request automation. This is another form that people submit, and then it creates pledges automatically. So one of the things that, because it's creating gift record, meaning it's asking for campaign fund and appeal, and knowing our staff, they will always get the campaign fund and appeal wrong one time in their life. So again, we have a full scope of work that is being done. And then if that full scope fail, I'm going to send a message. So this is still, this is my catch-all net, right? This is my catch-all net. But other than the catch-all net, you can also cast other nets that catches other piece of error. So let's come into where some of these error can happen. So let's come down to, let's say, this particular path. I'm basically checking, I have a data warehouse of all my campaign information. So I'm saying, hey, I'm going to check the campaign lookup ID that was given on the form, and is this a valid campaign ID? And basically the condition checks for it. Hey, if we have the results, then we're good to go. But if there's no results, then we run into the problem, hey, the campaign that was provided by the user is actually incorrect. So therefore, we can go ahead and post a message to the recipient is myself. Okay. No, okay, this one is not a good one. Sorry, because in this particular case, the campaign was not provided by the requester. So let's not use that one as an example. So I'm actually sending myself a message. The campaign ID somehow is missing. So a systematic error. So that's a good point. By the way, it's a good thing that I mentioned this. Sometimes the error can be a result of other situations, not necessarily the user providing the wrong information. And that's when you might want to alert yourself instead of alerting the requester. So let's go to the one where I was planning to talk about, which is the user providing the wrong appeal ID. This is actually provided by the user. And then I'm going to, again, check for if the appeal lookup ID exists or not. And if it exists, go ahead, continue the path. Yes, does nothing, meaning we found the appeal ID. So move on to check the next item. But if we're not found, then what we're going to do is we're going to message and say there's a problem. In this case, again, I'm sending it myself, almost like a check for my own. But I am sending an email to the requester, the responder of the form, and say, hey, you provided a not valid appeal ID in RE. You're going to need to resend the submission, providing the correct appeal ID. And then this is where I'm going to talk about the terminate. So you know the appeal ID is wrong. You can continue because the appeal ID is wrong. You cannot create a pledge record, a gift record with the wrong appeal ID. That doesn't exist in Razor's Edge. Therefore, you terminate. You say, hey, no good. We're going to stop. We're not going to continue. All these subsequent steps is not going to continue because we now terminated. Question probably in your mind is, why are you terminating with a success message? Okay, so that's the important thing I want to talk about now, and that is the success message. You can terminate with a couple of things. You can terminate with a success message. You can terminate with cancel. You can terminate with a fail. And if you terminate with a fail, for example, you could provide an error code, and you can provide a message. Now, the way that I look at it, and by no means, I think someone mentioned this over the conference many times, it may or may not be best practice, but it works. Now, I'm going to explain why it works for me. So when, to my way of thinking, and it could be different for yours, is that, hey, there is an error, but I handled the error already by telling the requester that, hey, you provided the wrong information, go submit it again with the correct information. I have handled the error, and therefore, what do you call it? I made the determination that the program, the flow needs to stop now. Successfully terminate, telling the person that you have failed to provide the right information. Now, why is this important? I'm not, for those of you that have run many flows, you probably have realized that when your flow failed a couple of situations failed, you get an email from Microsoft telling you that a certain flow has failed. How many times have failed in the last 7 days, something like that. Okay, so is this a situation, the particular situation about an appeal was incorrectly provided? Is this a situation that warrant your further investigation of the error? In my opinion, it's a no. The person provided the wrong appeal ID. It has been taken care of. He needs to resubmit it. There's nothing wrong with the flow that I need to fix. Therefore, I don't want to see in the Microsoft message that say, hey, there's an error on this flow. I want this flow to be successful. Therefore, Microsoft email doesn't say there's something wrong with the flow that I have. So that is the reason why I choose to have a success message here that basically just terminates the flow and call it a day. There's nothing more that needs to be done. I don't have to look at the flow to correct anything in the action or the logic. That's the reasoning behind a successful terminate message. As you have more flow, you start to realize that the email that Microsoft gives you is, for my way of handling it, is that if Microsoft send me a message saying my flow has failed X number of times, that's a flow that I need to go and take a look at why it fails, and do I need to put more error handling in to handle that particular situation. Okay, so let me take a look at my time here. I don't know if I'm going over 12:41. Not sure how long my session goes, so let me just take a quick look at my agenda here. If someone can wrap, I have how long?
9 more minutes.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Actually, perfect. Okay, let's move on to the next item. Okay, so we kind of already talked about the next item, which is team message, right? We're going to use team message to alert ourselves of error instead of relying on Microsoft message, which is, think of it as Microsoft email saying the flow has failed. Think of that as unhandled errors that Microsoft is telling you. using the team message or email to alert yourself of error are error that has been handled, but maybe not handled to the point to your liking, and you might want to check on that. So for example, yeah, let's come back to this particular flow here. Okay. For example, my catch all, let's come back to, like I mentioned, I have casted more nets to catch exception within the greater scope of the full process. This is my catch all. And if I were to receive a message that say it failed, quote unquote, generally, meaning within the full process itself, there are something that fail that I did not catch within it. So for example, I'll give you an example. Let's say this is executing a SQL query to find out if the campaign is correct, is a correct campaign code or not. Again, let's not use campaign, let's use appeal, same thing. Now, let's say that the SQL Server, Azure, let's say Azure SQL for my instance went down. So this action is going to fail. It's going to attempt a couple of times, retries. My retry, I'll talk about that a little bit. So in settings for every single action, there is a retry policy. Some of them, I leave them as default retry. So it's gonna, the default retry policy, I believe, is like 8 retries and is exponentially retries, like 1 minute it's failed, then it's gonna do 2 minute and then 4 minute mark and something like that. I don't remember the exact minutes, but generally for certain ones that I know is not going to fail that easily, I will have default. If I know certain things is more likely to fail, I will probably have more retry policy that more suited for the situation. That's up to your own knowledge of this actions. But let's say if this action were to fail, I don't have a condition for this failure. Meaning I could potentially create a parallel branch that have another actions which sends a different message that say, hey, this Azure SQL action has failed, come back with a failure, and then terminate. I could do that. But because this is what I deem to be less likely to happen, I allow the catch-all, the full scope catch-all error message to say, okay, if there are other things that fail within this whole scope, just send me a message, I'll take a look at it. And then my investigation may come down to, oh yeah, it's a once in a blue moon Microsoft SQL Server service failure. There's nothing I need to do and move on. The flow may have to be resubmitted and all of that stuff. It takes me back to the flow because of the message. And then I could just go ahead and resubmit the flow if it makes sense to do so, depending on what error it was, right? So with that said, I kind of touch on this a little bit, which is how much is too much handling. You could, for every single actions, have an error branch, a parallel branch that you mark with when the last action failed, do this. That would be too much, right? That's the extreme. Every single action, you are going to have an error branch. That's too much, and it will clutter up your flow. What you could do is a scope that kind of like a catch-all, like I did, and then within it, there are certain things that you know can fail from because of users or because of system, and handle it that way, right? So I want to say is error handling is more of an art than it is a science, right? Regardless of high code, low code, or no code, it is more of an art. Depends on what you are creating, what you're doing in your flow. Then you determine your course of action of what you need to catch as an error, either to cancel the request or to alert yourself, to alert the requester, or things like that. With that, I want to close. Go have it your way is really what this is about. Have fun with it. And Flow is great program for low and no coders. But it does require you to think a little bit as to what you want to do to handle what kind of errors. Thank you so much.
Alex, that was fantastic. I bet the folks that trickled in from the keynote after you got started, didn't even realize that your bandwidth was constricted, that your internet's out, and that you were presenting through a phone hotspot, handled like a pro. Do you have time for a question or two? I see there's at
Yes.
least one in the chat.
Okay.
Okay. Mark asks, is parallel flow using configure run after more efficient than using a condition? It seems like it could replace a condition where the condition is asking if a value is a blank or not.
Okay, so let me, they are not a replacement. Okay, I want to put it that way because configure run after is going to have information about what the last action that failed. So instead of using a condition, you're actually saying that, for example, what kind of failure are we talking about? So let's say you issue a Sky API call using a Blackbot action, right? Blackbot connector action. If Blackbot were to provide information back and say this failed, whatever the failure reason may be, you could, in that case, you can use either, right? You could just do configure run after when it failed, a parallel action, do it that way. That's one way of handling it, and then do whatever you want to do on that and say, let's say you're trying to get a constituent and the ID you provided was actually an invalid ID. So what will happen? You'll get a 404 error code from the action of get constituent. And if you have a parallel branch for the error handling, it'll go to that branch. However, could you have a condition that takes a look at the return body, the output body, with the status code and check for the status code of 404? You could, but you could have other status code. 200 is successful. You have 404. You could have 401. You could have other status code. You may not want to check all of that. So with a condition, I find at least, again, art more than science, I find it more easy to use the configure run after a error handling situation that Microsoft built in for you in the flow than it is to use a condition to run. Because at the end of the day, let me go to, hopefully I can, since there's only one question, I can go do it this way for you. So for example, here, if you were to have I do have a Sky API call somewhere here. Boo. Where to go? Here, each constituent. Okay, let's say this one. Oh, never mind, because that's the last action in that box there. So let's not use that. Okay, so let's say I'm creating the pledge, right? And then I'm parsing the JSON from the pledge. If I were to do the condition error handling path, what I'll have to do is I have to configure run after and make sure that this has failed as a checkbox in here too. Oh, okay, hold on. There we go. Because generally, only when the last action is successful, the next action will run, right? So if you want to have the condition to check for the status code of the last action, you have to make sure that your condition has both is successful and has failed in there. And then it will run that condition regardless of successful and failure, and then dissect the yes and no from there for the status code, and then do it that way. In my mind, that would be a more cumbersome way of doing things. You're putting more actions inside a conditions, inside a condition layer or tier. What's the exact word? I don't remember. But you can only go so deep in your tier, so you don't want to put too much into like these boxes, if you want to call it that. Hopefully that answers some of your question. You could use condition, but I think when applicable, using configure run after would be the better choice. There's a question about what is QR code. Not related, but I'll answer that. A QR code you guys have been using on the Slido. Basically, if you use your camera, point it to the QR code, it takes you to a URL. So to explain that quickly a little bit is that we have donation forms that is configured and then is a URL. So basically, our staff will be able to take the URL, pop it into the request form, and then uses our company logo, generate a QR code to have our company logo right in the middle, and print it out to like some material, printed paper or like a flyer, and then donor can scan the QR code and get to our donation page. So that's what that is. Oh, Austin already answered that. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? I think that's it.
That's it. Alex, thanks again for hanging in with us. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.